We have here PJ Hagerty. He's a senior developer advocate at Mattermost. He's the founder of DevRelate.io, which is actually a sponsor here as well, so take a look at his booth. He's a board member of Open Sourcing Mental Illness. He's the organizer of DevOps Day Buffalo, Code Days, and Elixir Days. He probably doesn't have much free time, but he's managed to spare an hour for us today to give us his talk, When You Aren't Sure If You Are Who You Thought You Were, which is a bit of a mouthful. PJ, please, take it away.
Awesome. So let me get my screen straight, sharing situation. And if you have questions, feel free to ask them. I will answer them after because for those of you who are familiar with Keynote, you know that now that I've hit play, I can no longer see anything. So this talk is called When You Aren't Sure If You Are Who You Thought You Were. A look at imposter syndrome. It could also be called PJ tried to find the longest title he could, and I'm pretty sure I won on that front. So as Court said, I founded a place called DevRelate.io. We work with a lot of different companies. I also work full-time as a senior dev advocate at Mattermost. But what DevRelate does is we work with companies to get them in touch with the communities they work in. We do podcasts and speaking at conferences and wearing T-shirts and figuring out what conferences you should sponsor and things like that. These are some of the great people that we work with, and feel free to reach out and ask me about any of them after the talk, though, because that's not what this talk is about. A little bit about me. I am a developer relations specialist. That is a completely made-up title. I'm not going to lie. If you don't know what developer relations is, we are people who go out there and work in community on behalf of our clients or our companies to be a member of a community. We're not just there to sell or shill or whatever. Our job is to get out there and talk about what the community wants to talk about, whether that be new technology or what's going on in the community or things that are happened. As Court mentioned, and as you saw on the slide and on my T-shirt, I am a board member at OSMI, which is Open Sourcing Mental Illness. It's a company that specializes in the mental health in the tech forum. So if you want to learn more about that, osmihelp.org, that'll be on some slides at the end. But before I really get started, there's a very key and important thing that I have to say. I am not a licensed professional mental health expert. I am many things. And I know it sounds weird that I'm going to start with a negative when I'm talking about imposter syndrome, but I'm literally not a licensed mental health professional. So bear that in mind. This is from my experience and my research. If you are having an issue, please seek out appropriate medical attention. That said, a word of caution. We're going to be talking about topics of mental health. Some of the things here may trigger something inside of you. Maybe you have some feelings. You might not even be aware of the fact that this is going to happen. I'm letting you know now that there's a bit of a whoa factor with a lot of these talks. Please know your limitations and understand that I'm not offended by questions or challenges here, but I ask that we be respectful of the mental states of everybody here, and I will do my best to do the same. That said, if you feel uncomfortable or you feel like you can't handle what we're talking about, please feel free to go. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I totally understand. So let's get started. That was all preamble. I hope you enjoyed the preamble. That was 2.5 minutes long. So my look into imposter syndrome began in a cafe in a totally different country. The setting isn't super important, but these words began a conversation with a friend of mine, a fellow developer and a speaker. And they said, I think I've lost my identity. So we're sitting there in this brightly lit cafe, a day after a conference where I felt like things really went well. We both gave presentations. The interesting thing is mine was like the soft talk. I was talking about meetups and using open source projects as a metaphor for meetups and how you have to kind of have, different things going on. So like that's the soft talk. I don't really like the term soft talk, but that's what it was. They spoke about internal garbage collection of an open source language. So super deep dive technical stuff. So I was really confused on what this was about. And I was concerned that there was something here beyond my understanding. They said, I think I've lost my identity. And they followed up, luckily, with not like it's been stolen or something, or someone's impersonating me, which was good because I can't handle that either. I'm not a professional SecOps person. Just, I don't know who I am as a developer anymore. Okay, so I was still kind of blindsided. But at least this was a mental health issue I was familiar with, and maybe even I've experienced this firsthand to a degree. With this statement comes a mixture of relief and concern. Relief because at least it's not literal identity theft, though in comparison, that's a mere inconvenience. No, it wasn't about memory loss or amnesia or even schizophrenia, none of which I'm equipped to handle. No, what we're talking about here is imposter syndrome. So let's discuss what that means. If anyone's ever seen me give a talk before, I've been to CPOSC before, I've been to a bunch of different conferences. I always like to start with definitions so we're all working on the same language. So I'm going to read you a little definition. Imposter syndrome is a psychological pattern in which an individual doubts their skills, talents, or accomplishments and has a persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. So it's also known as imposter phenomenon, imposterism, fraud syndrome, or the imposter experience. Despite external evidence of their competence, no matter how much you tell these people that they're wrong, those experiencing this phenomenon remain convinced they're frauds and that they do not deserve anything, much less all that they've achieved. Individuals with imposterism incorrectly attribute their success to luck or interpret it as a result of deceiving others into thinking they are more intelligent than they perceive themselves to be. For those unfamiliar with this concept, imposterism is defined as having feelings of inadequacy that persist in the face of information indicating the opposite is true. So that's my definition. I think that works a little bit better. This feeling permeates regardless of having a successful career, being recognized by your peers, winning awards, having the ears of crowds at conferences hanging on your every word like I know you're doing right now. It doesn't really matter what you do when you have imposter syndrome or how much you achieve. Nothing makes you believe that you've done it. Nothing makes you believe that it was anything but luck or weird stuff or fate or some happenstance. Something came in between you and your success that made it happen, and it definitely wasn't you. It was nothing you've ever achieved. So to clarify, let's start with the types of imposter syndrome. So researchers have discovered 5 types. And a lot of them sound like they overlap, so they're not necessarily strict silos, they're more like a Venn diagram. So there's the perfectionist, the superwoman man person, the super person, we'll go with super person, the natural genius, the soloist, and the expert. We're going to look at each one and see if we can find examples of this in people you know, or maybe even in your own behavior, but we'll describe exactly how it works. And we'll start with the perfectionist. Perfectionism and imposter syndrome go hand in hand. Think about it. Perfectionists set excessively high goals for themselves, and when they fail to reach that goal, they experience major self-doubt and worry about measuring up. They're not good enough because it wasn't perfect. How many times have you heard the phrase, perfect is the enemy of good? Perfectionists don't believe that. Only perfection is good. Whether they realize it or not, this group could also be called control freaks, which is kind of demeaning. They feel like they want something done right, and they have to do it themselves. There is no choice. Some behaviors here include being a micromanager. How many of us have been micromanaged? Just raise your hand by yourself. We'll make it just feel like we all can see each other. I've been micromanaged. I know I've been micromanaged. A lot of times perfectionists have a lot of difficulty delegating tasks or jobs. They also tend to accuse themselves of not being cut out for the job simply because they missed one self-made benchmark. So a benchmark they set for themselves, and they didn't meet that, and therefore this probably isn't the job for them. For this type of imposter syndrome, success is rarely satisfying because they believe they could have done even better, no matter what. I climbed Mount Everest, so I probably could have jumped off of it and touched the moon. Not good enough. But that's neither productive nor healthy. Owning and celebrating achievements is essential if you want to avoid burnout, find contentment, and cultivate some sort of self-confidence that works externally as well as internally. So since people who experience this phenomenon, the Superman, Superwoman, super person, they're convinced they're phonies among real deal colleagues. They often push themselves to work harder and harder to measure up. So you have to prove yourself to be a hero. And a lot of times they feel that they're covering up their insecurities with a false identity of being this amazing thing. But this is just a cover up for their insecurities. And the work overload kind of tends to harm their own mental health, but also their relationship with others. So people who kind of qualify as super people often stay later at the office than the rest of the team, even past the point of completing that day's necessary work. They'll still stay at the office so they can pull more hours, do more things, maybe even prep for tomorrow. They get stressed when not working, and they find downtime completely wasteful, complete waste of time, no hobbies, no nothing. That gets in the way. They let hobbies and passions that they may have had in the past completely fall by the wayside. They sacrifice it all to work. Imposters who are super women, super men, super people are workaholics. And they're actually addicted to the validation that comes from working, not to the work itself. The work is the work. That doesn't matter. But they love the validation that comes from working. Completing a task, even if it's a small task, they're like, yeah, I got that done. Sometimes they even reason that they're alpha personalities, or maybe this is more relatable, 10x developers. So they can excuse this excessive behavior and say it's not part of a mental health issue. It's just me being 10x all the time. So natural genius. These types of imposters set their internal bar impossibly high, just like perfectionists. But natural genius types don't just judge themselves based on ridiculous expectations. They also judge themselves based on getting things right on the first try. When they're not able to do something quickly or fluently, their alarm goes off. Red flags, big bells. And some of those red flags include having a track record of getting tons of praise or rewards for doing what comes naturally. Disliking the idea of having a mentor, not being able to handle feedback even when it's positive, and avoiding challenges outside one's own comfort zone. So think about this. This is kind of the idea of that kid in high school who never had to study but got straight A's. And it wasn't so much they were a natural genius. It's actually because they weren't really being challenged, or they took notes well enough to not really have to worry about studying. There's nothing special about the person. But as soon as they had a challenge, oftentimes with the high school genius, it was immediately as they went to college and they were challenged, with new ideas and new ways of doing things for the first time, that they found out they weren't a natural genius. They were just someone who got easy work pretty well. Sound like anybody you know? Probably it does. The soloist. So sufferers who are soloists, they feel as though asking for help reveals their phoniness. Like it shows everyone else that they don't know what they're doing. There's nothing wrong with being independent. Don't get me wrong. But not to the extent that you refuse assistance so that you can prove you're worthy, so you can prove that you prove you have the knowledge. Here's some of the behaviors associated are demanding to accomplish everything on your own. Framing a request in terms of the requirements of a project rather than the needs of a person. In other words, I need this done by such and such a time because blah, blah, blah. And what you're actually saying is I need this done because I need it so that I can feel better, but I'm framing it as the needs of the project. Letting a project fail in silence instead of asking for assistance or guidance. I actually, ironically, or not ironically, I never used that word correctly, had a conversation about this today with my friend Brian Lyles on Twitter. Brian was talking about how many GitHub repositories do you have that are just abandoned projects that you've never really gotten back to. And he was like, well, it's interesting because I feel like a lot of that shows that you had a good idea, but maybe you didn't have the time to execute it. And I said, it's interesting because I was just researching this, and it turns out a lot of it is because you're afraid to share it with somebody because you're afraid they might think you're a phony. And a lot of times, you'll just leave it go, or you'll leave it private. No one will ever see it, or you delete it. So we're actually having a big back channel discussion about that I will continue after this talk. But that's kind of how the soloist works. Then, of course, there's the expert. The expert measures their competence based on what and how much they know or can do, believing they will never know enough. They fear that they will be exposed as inexperienced or unknowledgeable. Experts tend to shy away from applying to job postings unless they meet every single educational requirement. They are constantly seeking out trainings or certifications because they think they need to master their skills in order to succeed. And just a quick side note on that. Certifications, I'm a big non-fan of certifications. I'm very anti-certification, and I'll tell you why. It seems to be that this is an industry thing that happens every few years, and it kind of preys on the validation idea. Like, and this is going to show my age a little bit, I'm an MCSE. I'm a Microsoft certified engineer. That means that I can do all of this stuff. And what it really means is I paid for a course and studied it. It doesn't mean that I'm better at someone that has a lot of experience. It just means that I have a certification for it. But that kind of preys on this whole imposter syndrome thing, like, more certifications mean more things. Now you're seeing it more and more where people are giving out DevOps certifications. And I'm even seeing in the developer relations field where people are saying, we can certify you to be DevRel. What does that even mean? But back to experts. Experts tend to feel like they never know enough, and they shudder when being called an expert. They'll call themselves hobbyists, or, I just kind of know that because I read up on it. They'll never say that they're an expert. This does clash a little bit with what I said, but I'm literally not a licensed medical physician. So I should probably change the wording on that. You may see some of these behaviors in yourself and others. Now that we know the types, let's touch a little bit more on imposter syndrome in general and a bit on how it relates to the tech field. So one of the things that we focus on as coders, developers, database engineers, designers, especially in the team-focused age that we're in now, is being on a team of people so much smarter than we are. This is something we celebrate and we boast about when we talk about our jobs. People are always happy to tell you that they're a link in a chain with the best minds in the business. Every time we say this, though, it can be causing like a small seed in our minds to start to bloom. And that seed is saying, if everyone on the team is so awesome, am I the one who is less awesome, in fact? Is my contribution somewhat less than the next person? This seed, once planted, is insidious. Some people overcome it. Perhaps through individual perseverance, or maybe they just work in a less toxic workplace. But others let this seed consume them. There's a balance to the juxtaposed internal and external situation here. It's difficult to keep things moving forward and avoid feelings of imposter syndrome when both internally and externally you're being made to think this is true. This is true on toxic teams. Can even be true on positive teams depending on how the reinforcement comes in. Keep that in mind when you talk to your employees and your teammates. This issue is compounded by the fact that most people suffering from issues of imposter syndrome are likely to engage in behaviors that cause others to feel out of place or put on the wrong foot. I mean, we can look at some of those examples from our 5 types. A soloist might make someone feel like they aren't good enough because the soloist keeps all the work on a project to themselves, so they're not willing to share it with me. So I must not be good enough to work on it. A natural genius, right, might refuse to take in new perspectives from someone who's offering, making them feel their opinion isn't valid. You know, the natural genius, well, they always know so much. They're always so talented. When I said, let's use React instead of Vue, they just shut me down. And it's really because the natural genius is afraid they don't know Vue. They don't want it. A super person might go through that whole hero behavior that makes other people feel inferior and is often rewarded in the workplace, even though hero behavior shows that we haven't built our apps correctly. It's a vicious cycle. It's all a vicious cycle. And it makes it that much more difficult to suss out and work toward resolving issues of imposter syndrome. Then we also have some modern accelerants. One of the general things that I've said this word a few times. One of the general symptoms of imposter syndrome is suffering. The sufferer feels like a fraud. You feel like you're not doing anything for real. You're fraudulent. This comes into glaring focus in today's everything is public coding world. At any point in time, you can see the level of check-ins on any person's GitHub or GitLab account. Some people, especially those that they feel like they're imposters, they feel graded and that their contribution isn't enough. As if there is a standard of participation we all need to achieve. All those tweets that you see of people like, look at my 365 days of green, you're not helping. All you're saying is you work too hard. Maybe you're the imposter because you're working so hard to prove you can code 365 days in a row. Doesn't help anyone in that situation. The idea that everyone needs to meet an imaginary level of acceptable contribution brings many to the conclusion that they will never reach that level, so maybe don't bother. It's a perception that feeds paranoia, which turns into and feeds imposter syndrome. It's difficult to avoid feeling a public judgment when what developers do, especially in the open source world, is so publicly visible. This is also something we can't do much about in our current environment. It's possible to make our work private, but hiding contributions and stuff is just avoiding the problem. And that's just not very good open source behavior. We need to enable developers to take heart in the fact that any amount of contribution is available and every little bit helps. One thing that I do, especially with new people who are looking to get into open source, is I teach them to work with documentation first. They worry that it's not enough, but at the same time, documentation, I think we can all agree documentation needs to be fixed. None of it's any good. There are great examples, but nothing's perfect. At the same time, everything iterates, everything needs to be new and functional. So it's a great place to get in. It helps you learn the place. It helps you feel a little bit less like an imposter, a little bit more like you belong on that team. So, recognize imposter system. The first step to recognizing issues with yourself or others when it comes to imposter syndrome is to zero in on a few facts. First off, we're speaking about a mental health issue, and like me, I imagine very few people who are at the Central Pennsylvania Open Source Conference are qualified mental health practitioners, therapists, or professionals. Just a guess. I don't think it's the audience. We're not qualified to diagnose anyone. But if we see some things, we can certainly help out. Some things we need to be careful of, even when looking at ourselves, is labeling things incorrectly or applying names to mental health issues and giving them a temporary status that someone might have. We all have periods of feeling inadequate or that we're not up to snuff, and that's okay. There are plenty of factors that go into this. Imposter syndrome is really much more sustained. It can happen for years and can lead to other mental issues and behaviors if left unchecked. So why do people experience imposter syndrome? Here's the bad news. I always have a bad news slide in every presentation I've ever given, and this is the one. There's no single answer. Some experts think it has something to do with personality traits like anxiety or neuroticism. Others focus on family or behavioral causes. For example, being always told you're the golden child and you'll never get anything wrong. You're so great, you're a genius. How could that possibly go wrong? Sometimes childhood memories, such as feeling that your grades were never good enough for your parents or that your siblings outshone you in certain areas, can leave a lasting impact. I get that. I'm a middle child. Sometimes it's the need to achieve in a competitive job, I don't know, like being a developer in tech, that bases what we do on our mental abilities. I pretty much just described what we did. It's competitive. Everything that we do is not based. Yeah, we write code with our hands, but we use our brains. This is also the major reason why there's so much stigma about mental health issues in tech. And imposter syndrome is no different. If there's even an inkling of the possibility that someone is suffering from imposter syndrome or any mental health issue, there's no reason to believe that the very nature of jobs and technology won't consistently trigger issues. Beyond that, if you think about it, we think about our tools as our computers, our keyboards, our many monitors and various rigs that we all have set up now that we all work from home. But the tool that you use most is your brain. Most people are embarrassed to say, hey, my brain doesn't work right and I need to get it fixed. But that's the wrong attitude to take, and we really need to focus on keeping that working better than anything else. You can always get a new laptop. Can't get a new brain. You can only fix the one you have. First thing we look for in recognizing someone with imposter syndrome is their outward behavior. It's a common misconception that a person's going to be like super shy or quiet or more introverted because they have imposter syndrome. That's just not true. It's 100% the opposite. Most people with imposter syndrome are very self-confident in the eyes of others. They don't see it themselves, but they sometimes come off as having so much bravura and so much confidence that just exudes, in some cases so much so their coworkers and their teammates say oh, it's so admirable that so-and-so is so confident. I wish I had that. So this is what's known as a contraindication. In other words, it's the opposite of the expected behavior, but that's the true behavior. You're so confident that you're pushing out confidence so no one finds out that you're an imposter. The imposter cycle, as defined by Dr. Pauline R. Clance, begins with an achievement-related task. So we're getting kind of sciencey here. An example of an achievement-related task could be like building a new feature for the front end, or building a new feature for the back end, building a new feature. Once someone's been assigned a task, the assignment, the feelings of anxiety and self-doubt and worry immediately follow. The cycle accounts for about 2 possible reactions that stem from these feelings. One will respond either by over-preparation or by procrastination. If the person responds with procrastination, the initial response will turn into a frantic effort to complete the job. Once the task has been completed, there'll be a brief period of accomplishment and a feeling of relief. And if someone gives positive feedback like, hey, great job on that new feature, the new front end looks great. Once the work's been done, they get that comment and they'll immediately discount that positive feedback. They'll say it was luck. They'll say they pulled off an 11th hour miracle. They'll say whatever to make sure that it isn't because of the work that they did. On the other side, if the person over-prepares, even if it goes successfully, they'll view the entire thing as a failure because it wasn't perfect. It didn't meet the same vision that it met in their heads. So usually the response to over-preparation is a successful outcome was a result of hard work. That's usually the feedback you get. If it's procrastination, you view the outcome as a matter of luck. In the imposter cycle, gaining success through hard work or luck is not interpreted as a matter of true personal ability, not by the individual. This means it doesn't matter which mechanism somebody used to complete the task, whether they procrastinated or overprepared. It doesn't matter. The outcome falls flat, even with a positive response, even with the feedback getting. It has no effect whatsoever on the person, the individual's perception of their own personal success. This leads to discount of positive feedback. So this sequence of events serves like as a reinforcement, causing the cycle to keep going in motion. With every cycle, feelings of being fraudulent, self-doubt, depression, and anxiety just add up and add up and add up and add up. As the cycle keeps going forward, increased success leads to the intensification of feeling like a fraud. That seems completely crazy. Like you're trying to say you're better, you're better, you're better, you're doing a great job, and this person is actually feeling more and more fraudulent. This experience causes the person to remain haunted by the lack of perceived personal ability, believing that at any point they're going to be exposed for someone who, by someone who thinks that they really keep the cycle in motion. So what can we do? Once we know and we can identify the feelings in ourselves and others, how do we mitigate things? In a team setting, a quick way to stomp this out is to continually validate all members of the team, even when not doing jobs specifically. So this might seem a little bit odd, but this has to be sincere validation, not pat on the back because you're part of the team. We're so glad you're here. But like an actual time in a meeting or stand up to cite something each person has done and appreciate their contribution, whether that contributed to the final part of a project or not. This gives each person a concrete accomplishment they can recognize and take pride in. At this point, especially with COVID and stuff going on, it might just be like, hey, I'm really glad you got up today. I don't even give a shit that you didn't get dressed. I'm glad you got your coffee and you're here. I'm just glad you're here. It's really an important message, especially right now. Don't expect someone with imposter syndrome, though, to immediately improve from this type of reinsurance. It takes a lot of work to bring someone from the internal dialogue of imposter syndrome, but it needs to start somewhere, and it can start with you. At the very least, you can take a step back and do something outside the normal coding routine that often helps. It seems like in our industry, there's even a stigma around taking time for yourself because we have the whole 10x developer concept and all that jazz. Often, though, this time is like needed to reevaluate your goals, establish a connection back to what made the person passionate about what they were doing in the first place. Taking a step back to find things that take the pressure off. Like this is super hard right now, especially when you can barely walk away from where you work. But there's ways to build up team rapport and things that people do. Build up friendships instead of just coworker relationships to help people trust each other and to trust themselves. This will create what they call a psychologically safe environment, and it'll foster communication. Also, there's the most obvious thing. If you think you have issues with imposter syndrome and you don't want to deal with it on a work level, seek out therapy. There is no shame whatsoever in speaking with a mental health professional who can direct your energy toward improvements. And I know that's difficult right now because you can't actually go in and see someone, but there are lots of online services that will help you do this. Even if you don't think you have an issue with imposter syndrome or any other mental health issue, get a therapist. It's likely there's something lingering somewhere just under the surface that a conversation with someone outside of your social circle, outside of your family, outside of your friends, who you can just kind of unload to, it might help to uncover and help you like improve your day-to-day life. What's the harm? So the other key thing with imposter syndrome is to know that you're not alone. It's not uncommon. It actually affects a lot of people. And it doesn't mean you'll never find success. Each person on this slide, every single one of them, has stated that they suffer from imposter syndrome, and they've been some of them have been diagnosed by doctors that they have imposter syndrome. They overcame it to a point where they could be a paragon in their field. So, in case you don't know, we'll start in the upper left. That is Tom from Radiohead, one of the most famous, alternative rock bands in the world. If you don't know who the person in the middle is, I'm not sure where you've been the last few years. On the right top row, that's Neil Gaiman. I never know how to pronounce his name. We've never met. Bottom left is David Tennant. Bottom center is Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And on the bottom right is Maya Angelou. And she gave one of the best examples of what it's like to suffer from imposter syndrome. She once said, "I've written 11 books, but each time I think, they're going to find out now. I've run the game on everybody, but they're going to find me out now." It's not a matter of being found out. It's a matter of learning to work within the parameters of accepting who you are and what you can do. Remember, studies show as many as 70% of people suffer from imposter syndrome at some point, with about half that number having repeated or long-term issues with it. There's no shame in admitting you might have a problem. There's no shame in going to get help for it. There's no shame in reaching out to someone who you think might have a problem. It's probably the best thing that you can do. So I have some additional resources here. Check out what we've done at osmihelp.org. We have a lot of guides and stuff. The second one is really great. It's a thing called mentalhealthfirstaid.org. It will not teach you to be a mental health professional. Do not expect that it will. What it will help you do is kind of recognize behaviors in others that might make you want to step in, say something, and see what's going on. And I think it's relatively cheap, and I think they are doing online training right now during COVID. Speak to a therapist. Can't emphasize that enough. Everyone should be doing this. Also, check out the work of Dr. Maureen Gannon, who's linked right there. And Time Magazine also has an awesome article that they did recently on imposter syndrome itself. For those of you who are saying, well, it's great you keep saying online therapy, so I do have some names if you want to walk a lot of apps where you can talk to a therapist. Talkspace is one of the best overall apps. For live chat, you can use BetterHelp. BetterHelp, actually, it's like a 30-minute session that you sit down and have. Talkspace sometimes is asynchronous. The best for couples is an app called Regain, where you can regain the magic of your relationship. You see what the marketing people did there? For teens, there's actually an app called Teen Counseling, pretty straightforward. For LGBTQ folks, plus, there's a thing called Pride Counseling that you can download. Peer support is an app called 7 Cups of Tea. Free assessment, you can get Doctor on Demand, and there's MD Live and Amwell, which are also a couple quick ways to get consultation and maybe get access to a psychiatrist if you feel it needs to go that far. So I'll be happy to publish all of that stuff after the talk, in case you can get a chance to get it. So the conversation kicking off this whole talk touched on all of the aspects and ended with, so what do I do to get my mojo back? This is what my friend asked me. And again, not being a professional, I suggested seeking out help. There's resources for people feeling less than adequate. Imposter syndrome can begin with internal low self-esteem. Remember, we talked about it might not show outwardly, but it can quickly spiral into depression and anxiety, and even neuroticism. A talk with a psychologist or a group where you can share experiences is often beneficial. Never underestimate your own value or the value that you bring to the people around you. Be kind to each other. Keep an eye out for those of us in trouble. And let's take off the imposter mask. Leave all the other masks on, COVID, but take off the imposter mask. And with that, thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
As you know, in case questions come in, or while questions come in, I just wanted to say, PJ, thank you. It was a great talk. There was actually a lot of discussion happening during the talk that I don't know. It was actually really great with the virtual format. People expressing their own experiences and things like that of course they wouldn't do in the middle of a live talk. So I thought it was awesome.
Exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, I know. Yeah, I thought the most interesting part of the talk when I was researching it was, I'm thinking, because I've had issues with imposter syndrome before. Actually, fun fact: when we first met, Court, way back in 2011, you were there with that team from Orchestra. And I came in being like one dude who had worked on a few apps, and I was like Ruby. And you guys were like hard coding everything. I was like, I do not belong talking to those people. Those people are way too cool. I'm going to stay over here and work in support. And so it's not like it's something that I received. So when I saw that list of people, and it's like, David Tennant, really? I mean, like, the guy's top of his game. He has the hottest podcast on Spotify. He was Doctor Who, for Christ's sake, and he thought he wasn't good enough. It's crazy. It's madness. But that's exactly. He has like a lifetime achievement award, and it's like, everyone up there was just, it's insane. It's not the right way to look at it.
Yeah. Well, I saw your comment about she's a Supreme Court justice. Why would she think she's not good enough? It doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah, that's crazy. Anyone have questions?
I know this is a tough subject, and you're more than welcome to DM me or, whether here in the conference. Joel? That's a great question, and a lot of that is the stem of the problem. So Joel is asking, what is good enough? Who defines good enough? And I think that's part of the problem, especially when it comes to imposter syndrome at work. Often that's determined by someone who may be a paragon in our industry, but also may have no idea what they're doing. Let's just put all the cards on the table. Sometimes good enough is determined by a project manager who doesn't know how to code, doesn't know how to write a front end or a back end or a database query or anything, and they're telling you how it's supposed to go. So, your issue with reacting to that is probably going to be like, well, what is good enough? What am I doing? Why are you defining this? I think for what your work is you have to determine that, and also continue to ask questions like, I feel this is good enough, but you're saying it's not. Can we discuss why? And be open to receiving feedback on that. I think good enough is a constantly moving needle that you have to kind of zero in on and eventually hit. But like, what is good enough is going to be different for every person, every team, every organization.
Any other questions? I want to remind folks, so you can, if you want to ask a question directly, you can just click the request to share audio video link in the upper right, and I'll get you loaded up. I'd just like to respond to Grant. Grant Sully, you're absolutely 100% right. This is an issue that we've talked about a lot at OSMI, especially with a lot of people saying like, oh, I'm so OCD, I have to put my shoes on before I step out the door. It's like, that's not OCD. That's not how that works. It's the same as you can feel sad and not suffer from depression. You can feel anxious and not have anxiety. I also argue if you're an extrovert, you probably don't have a Twitter account. Like if you're saying I'm a pure extrovert on Twitter and also saying #FB, so it goes to your Facebook and maybe there's a picture that gets picked up on Instagram, you're not really an introvert. I think I switched those two, but I think you get my point. A lot of times we use these labels and they're not appropriate. So yeah, OCD is like, having to turn a light on exactly 19 times every time before you leave a room. You cannot leave the room if you don't do it. So yeah, it's not just being a neat freak or making sure your room is picked up. Even if you think that's enough, if you feel you're OCD because you have to be clean constantly, see a therapist because there's probably something you need to look into. Christopher, I also agree with you. Acknowledging each other is super important. We talk a lot about things like diversity in tech, but we're generally talking about skin color and culture. But neurodiversity is also super important. There's lots of people who fall on the autism spectrum or have mental health issues, and they're not treated the same way that other people are. We have to acknowledge that these people exist. We have to acknowledge that these people are part of our group, part of the community, and learn more about them and figure out how to help. I had a question about the links. I will definitely be tweeting out the links, but I will also, Court, is there a way to post a bulletin board or something like that? I honestly don't know. I'll get back. So I know all the chat. We did verify all the chat that exists for all the sessions and everything gets recorded as well. So it's not.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not super nice in that it's not like you could watch the chat side by side with the video or anything like that. But we're going to make the recordings available, so I don't see any reason why we wouldn't make the chat available. So if you just want to post in chat, at the very least, people will be able to track it down there as well.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank Elise for answering Kevin before I did. Yeah, my Twitter handle is Splenic because, as for those of you who were at lunch, we were discussing bicycles. When I was 19, I lost my spleen, and it just happens to be that no one ever takes a medical condition as their username, so that's my Twitter handle. If you'd like to connect with me on Xbox, that's my Xbox thing. Steam, IRC, pretty much anywhere in the world, look up as Splenic. There's a 99% chance it's going to be me. But that's a whole other talk. Do you feel imposter syndrome is something more commonly reported or talked about in tech? I do feel like, and this could be my personal bias because, I work with the folks at OSMI. I do feel like we tend to notice it more in tech, or that we're at least more overt about it. But I also don't think we're catching people who are falling through the cracks. I've always felt that mental health issues in general, we tend to be pretty strong in. There's a reason why we came to tech, and most of it is because we have some sort of neurodiversity. We don't quite match up with the average, the average thinker, the average mind or whatever, for good or for bad. But I think that, imposter syndrome in tech is a huge thing. Also because we've gone through the past 15 years or so beating our chests and talking about how awesome tech is. And, to the point of framework wars and Vim versus Emacs and, oh, you're coding on a Mac? Disgusting. Oh, I'd never buy a Windows machine. And all of this flag waving just contributes to imposter syndrome in others. I remember the first conference I ever went to, the first open source conference. Kevin, you're not helping. I remember the first open source conference I ever went to, and I had a Dell laptop because I had just finished. I was a Visual Fox Pro programmer. Sorry, it's true. It happens. Don't do it. And I was moving to Ruby, so I went to a Ruby conference, and I'm like looking around, and I'm opening up my laptop with the big, very cringy, because that's what the Dells sound like back then when you open them. And everyone else is opening up their sweet MacBooks with a brushed chrome, and I'm like, wait a minute, do I belong here? And I actually had someone tell me, like, can you even run Ruby on that? And I was like, okay, I'm gonna leave. I'm just gonna leave. I feel like it's probably the best thing for me to do. But all that's crap. It's all bravado. It's all garbage. But I do think that does contribute to answer the question. I do think it contributes to causing more imposter syndrome in tech, which could be why we see it so often. But I also feel like part of the reason we think it's more in tech is because we also are a little bit more open about that. I think people are willing to say, I have imposter syndrome more often than people are willing to say, I have bipolar disorder. But it's still a mental health issue. It's just like you can take the easy one, the lower one, and be like, okay, so I won't deal with the real issue that's going on. I won't admit to that, but I'll say I have imposter syndrome, and that might cover for a few things. Absolutely, Court. Absolutely. I think anywhere where your brain power is what you're meant to succeed with, this is going to be an issue. I think I'm glad that we talk about it at least. I've seen other industries, like, I have lots of friends who work elsewhere where it's not like sales is actually a huge deal because everything they do is modern. Everything has very specific and very minute metrics. So a lot of times they do not feel like they're achieving anything. So imposter syndrome is huge there. Also with first responders, like I couldn't imagine meeting a doctor that thought they weren't good enough. I'm glad that they generally don't share that with me because that would be terrifying. But in general, yeah, I think imposter syndrome, it affects, experts say, about 70% of people. So at one point in time or another. Exactly. And then they asked you to fix their VCR. Oh, wait, that's an old person thing. Then they asked you to fix their... The biggest thing I had when Court and I used to work together at a cloud platform company, and people would say two things. First, if they saw me wearing the sweatshirt, they'd say, you work with trains? And I would say, no, it's just called engineering. And then they'd say, so what do you do? And say, oh, I work in the cloud. And they'd be like, oh my God, can you fix my iCloud for me? And I'd be like, no, I don't work at Apple. They're like, but iCloud. I'm like, yeah, what, your pictures are still... I can't get my pictures. Okay, yeah, I can't help you. I don't work there. But yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think sometimes that feeds into the imposter syndrome. Like, but I should know all of the clouds, shouldn't I? If I'm a cloud expert, I should know every cloud. But yeah, there are, you know what, Kevin, you're right. There are also physical side effects of imposter syndrome. Sometimes it can lead to things like weight gain or, other kind of issues. Just like any mental health issue, it can contribute to a lot of health factors, physical health factors that are really, really negative and really, really dangerous sometimes. Aaron Aldrich, ladies and gentlemen, knowing more about clouds than anyone else. I hope it does. It's interesting, Christopher, that you bring up a return to the office, employees hired during quarantine is going to bring new folks. Yeah, I can't imagine how people are going to react having been hired mid-pandemic and then possibly having to go back into an office with people who are essentially strangers. But you've also worked together for the last 6 months. Like, that's going to be kind of crazy. Can I still work around people the same way? It's a question we're all going to have to answer. Actually, I'm not going to answer it. I'm going to stay home. I've been working remote for like 13 years now. I don't think I can go back into an office. I'm not capable. No one wants to be there anyway.
All right. I think we're about good on time here. So, PJ mentioned if folks wanted to reach out to him via DM or something like that, do so. I know firsthand, the heart that PJ has, and how insightful he can be. This has certainly been a great glimpse into that. So thank you so much for your time, PJ, and your insights here, and all the work you do, by the way, with OSMI.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Cool. So
thanks, I appreciate it. They also have a booth here. Check out their booth as well.
That's a great idea. So yeah, folks. Also, yeah, PJ does have an expo booth and all that kind of stuff. I highly recommend you check out that as well as the OSMI booth. Thank you for your support, PJ. Thank you for your time.